Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress and columnist for the American Prospect. With me today is Brent Sasley. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Texas at Arlington, also a contributor to the Mideast Matrix blog and Open Zion at the Daily Beast. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to talk to you. We've engaged on Twitter and over email a little bit, but the first time I've talked to you on Foreign Entanglements. I think you said you've done this before once with Sarah Posner, I believe.
Yes.
But really glad to have you on the show.
And now we can really go at it.
That's right. I know it's all been prelude to this throwdown we're preparing for right now.
That's right.
So in the news this week, we've got Secretary Kerry, or I guess over the last few weeks, Secretary Kerry clearly making a big, I don't know what you want to call it, a big push or a big move, just talking to all kinds of people in the region, talking to the Israelis and the Palestinians to see what is possible, whether he's able to tee up a process or a restart of the process.
Right.
Clearly there's some challenges. The process has been stalled over the past few years for various reasons. A significant one being the Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas's continued demand for an Israeli settlement freeze. But anyway, what's your take on what Kerry's been up to? Do you think it's positive? And is there anything to, what is this moment like? What's going on here?
I think that Kerry is reflecting Obama himself. So I did have a piece earlier in which I argued that Obama's broader regional diplomacy has been more or less successful after his trip to Israel. So he worked on the Israelis. He said the right things. He visited Abbas. He got the apology to Turkey, or maybe not got, but he helped facilitate. He wants to bring in the Arab states. He wants to bring it into this broader regional thing. And I think that's a positive thing. I think that too often people forget that, sure, really it is Israelis and Palestinians, but the broader Arab-Israeli conflict still exists. And there still are multiple other issues in the region. And so a broader push to bring in as many actors provides everybody with cover, but it also provides each of them with leverage. And so I think that that's a useful thing. The downside, of course, is that it's much more difficult to get all of those actors to agree on certain things, but that's why it's a slow start.
So, he's been talking to everyone. We saw a few days ago that he made requests of Israelis and Palestinians to the Israelis. There was the request for even if a quiet, unannounced settlement halt.
Right.
Along the lines of how, I guess, Dan Meridor, a former minister and close advisor to Netanyahu, has said over the past few years that Israel should do, which is just limit it to the settlement blocks. It's unclear whether that's happening. From what I've seen, it seems like it's very possible that could happen.
Yes.
Which I think is I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as far as I can tell, there's still some uncertainty about. It's uncertain about who really made that decision, right. If that's just somebody's opinion.
Right. And I found that interesting because when I was over there, I was just a few weeks ago. I was there about a week before the president's trip. What I heard from some in the Palestinian government and the PA government, and particularly a close advisor to Abbas, was like, this is something that Abbas could accept. This is something that would help him get down from the tree, so to speak.
Sure.
Was a quiet, unannounced settlement freeze such that, the Palestinians themselves could see that the settlement building was being limited or stopped in various places. But then we saw a report, I guess, in both Haaretz from Barak Ravid and also in the Times of Israel, with some very, just an outright rejection from a number of Israeli officials saying that we're not going to give any of this stuff.
Yeah, sometimes the Israeli press, it's not always clear who is speaking, right. What right, level exactly. They are. I've argued before that the Israeli election and then the regional events and then the re-election of Obama has provided an opportunity. It's an opportunity that needs to be seized and made something of it. It won't lead to anything by itself. But I've argued before, and I know that lots of people disagree with me, but I think that Netanyahu is a pragmatic opportunist. I think if pushed in the right way and the conditions are right, he can be moved. He's no Yitzhak Rabin, he's no peace now advocate, but I think that he can be pushed in certain ways that will continue to open up more space, and this might be one of them. The question is whether or not he can sustain that in the new Israeli government coalition, in which it looks like settlers and Naftali Bennett's Jewish home have considerable sway.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the when I think about Bibi and the way he tends to operate, or at least I've observed the way he operates, I always think of that line from Jackie Brown where you can't trust Melanie, but you can trust Melanie to be Melanie.
Right.
If you're thinking about Netanyahu, I mean, if you think of it in terms of Netanyahu's own the political stakes for Netanyahu, and thinking about it in those terms, I mean, that is something that he's clearly very conscious of, like all politicians.
Sure.
I think particularly so with Netanyahu, and the fact of the matter is, over the past few years of his prime ministership, the political calculus has clearly come out in favor of him just, stiff-arming Obama and continuing to build the settlements and tending that part of his base. So the question I have is whether that calculation has changed at all, or whether it's even within the power of the United States to change it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of comparing him to Yitzhak Shamir, who was sort of the last really hardline Likud leader or prime minister, in the 1992 election, he insisted on talking about settlements and talking about fighting with the United States over the loan guarantees and saying, look, we are going to continue to spend our resources there. I don't care about these Russian immigrants. I don't care about these other problems. He was willing to stand by that, even when his advisors were saying, listen, we're getting into some electoral problems here. And he lost the election, in part because of that. I don't think Bibi would do that. I think that he would say, okay, you know what? I can see which way the winds are blowing. I can see that it would be more advantageous to me to go one way or the other. So I'll go that way. But I think he needs to be pushed. And I think you're right that the Americans need to really take up a big part of that. Whether or not they are willing to, I'm not so sure. I think Iran actually could be used. I mean, Iran provides an opportunity as well. I think Bibi he really is convinced Iran is a major strategic threat to Israel. But as you and others have reported, he really has over time shifted more toward Obama's position.
Yeah.
If there can be some form of trade-off there, that might be part of the space that the United States can create. But I mean, again, there are these really these deeper questions about how far he's willing to go. But I would argue that space is good. Some progress is good. I know that there's again some debate about that, but better than the status quo, I suppose, is one way to put it.
Right. I mean, again, that's the question. I mean, what is it? I mean, you can always say that there's something could happen that would upend the status quo. I mean, certainly, looking at the Middle East over the past 5 years, we know that to be true.
Right.
Something could happen between now and next year that could radically alter all of our perceptions about what is and is not possible. But in the absence of something crazy happening, again, I wonder. I mean, looking at the situation in the West Bank, the continuing divisions between the West Bank and Gaza, the reports of Fayyad, we've seen these rumors before, but there's something to these latest reports that seem a bit different to me and a bit more serious. And granted, it's anonymous sources from within Fatah, likely people who don't like Fayyad and would like what they're saying to be true, that he has, submitted his resignation. But clearly there are serious tensions between Abbas and Fayyad. The resignation of the finance minister, escalated those tensions pretty seriously. So to add to the problem of the Hamas-Fatah division, you now have the potential loss of a very key player in Fayyad, someone who has been, central to the general, whatever you want to call it, quartet Western international approach to this, which is, trying to build and reform Palestinian state institutions in preparation for, the end of occupation and statehood. And if he goes, it's really unclear, who's remotely there to take his place.
Well, that's the thing. The status quo is I don't think the status quo is sustainable. But if there's no push to one way or one direction or another, then Bibi will stay with the status quo. The question, it has to be put to him that the status quo right now is not good, but also that let's say there's 5 potential ways that things could go, that 4 of those ways are also not good. But that 5th way is a good way to go, and so let's start easing ourselves toward that. I think he would be open to that.
But then it really comes down to, what kind of pressure can be brought to bear on Israel.
Also true, yes. That's a good point.
And I just don't think there's any getting around that, because right now, I just, you have the issue of delegitimization. I think that is often overplayed somewhat opportunistically by the Israeli government, by some of their advocates around the world, especially here in the U.S. But, it does exist. I don't think there's any question there. But apart from that, it's unclear. I don't see any real costs that Israel is incurring from the occupation and from continuing to build settlements. It's such that it's gotten so ridiculous that, I was referring to the concessions, and I'm not going to make air quotes, but I'll just say
okay.
When Kerry is seeking, concessions from both sides, on the one hand, he asks for the Israelis to quietly stop building settlements, which they shouldn't be doing anyway, which they've already committed to stop doing under the roadmap, on top of them being just illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention to begin with. And on the other side, you've got the Palestinians agreeing to forego seeking legal relief or seeking to, have their rights addressed with regard to settlements. And I think the stark, the asymmetry of those two concessions, air quotes, is pretty amazing.
Well, and here's also why I think that this is a moment. So, and again, this, unless the moment is seized, it won't mean anything. But so in the United States, you have Obama reelected. He's just won a couple big battles against, let's say, the hawkish right when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. He had Chuck Hagel nominated. He doesn't have to worry about reelection. I think you also have if we're talking about the Jewish pro-Israel lobby, which the common consensus is that if they mobilize their power, and primarily we're talking about AIPAC, although it's not only AIPAC, but if they mobilize their power against the president, they can sway the policymaking process. But AIPAC itself is facing, some people might say challenge is too strong a word, but they're facing a challenge from the right. And so AIPAC is also in the position of having to fend off the right and not move too much to the right on what it does or what it lobbies on. And so I think to some extent Obama has some cover from let's say, the moderate center when it comes to the Jewish pro-Israel lobby. So that, again, there's some space in which he could propose solutions or different ideas. Plus, Iran. I think Iran could really be used as a lever. And there were reports today that Obama and Bibi they still disagreed, and Obama just kept saying during his visit to Israel, look, you need to trust me, you need to give me time, and Bibi would say, no, I'm not so sure I can, it means something different for me. But Bibi has given him time, he has given him the space, he has moved closer to him. That could be made a lever. It would take, enormous political capital, it would take, a sustained willpower. It's possible. The next question is
how. Just draw that out for a bit for me. Like, explain how it's used as a lever. I have a sense of what you mean, but just for
sure that explain what you mean. Look, Obama could say to the Israelis, listen, we've gone to the mat for you at the UN, even though there've been lots of problems with that. Look what we're doing to Iran. We're convincing our allies. We're keeping them on board. These sustained economic sanctions. We're keeping up this pressure. We're not joining in negotiations. We're standing firm. We're committed to stopping Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which I think is what Obama and the administration repeats every so often. We are doing that, but you need to give us something else in return. You need to give us something. We're trying here, but it can't just be all of this. Just like, the way that Bush and Baker handled Shamir in 1991. I'm not saying this is a direct comparison, and there are other issues there, but if Shamir can go to the peace process, if Shamir can go to Madrid, and Shamir was far more of a hardliner than Bibi was, then I think that there's space for Bibi too also.
No, I think that's interesting, and again, but I think it's worth looking at the way that the U.S. domestic debate has changed.
In a good way or a bad way?
Well, I would say in a bad way.
Sure.
To do what James Baker did, here's our number, give me a call when you're interested. to take steps with the loan guarantees and stuff like that. That's almost just out of the question right now. Because the bar for what actually qualifies as being pro-Israel. I mean, you have these attacks on Obama. I mean, when you read the bill of what he had done over his first term, I won't list them. I've written about it. You probably have too. Of all the various ways his administration had gone to the mat for Israel, whether the OECD, at the UN, in various places, both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes, and to be still attacked, by the various people on the right as, it's not enough, he doesn't really mean it, he doesn't really love Israel. It seems to me that the debate has gone so far round the bend, it's unclear to me what sort of, how he might leverage the Iran issue. I mean, I understand, I think what you're saying makes sense. I'm just saying, like, the costs of trying to play it that way politically seem to be much higher now than they were.
But less now that he's been reelected.
I think that's right. I think now that he has been reelected and he had those victories that you mentioned, the reelection obviously and the Hagel victory, I think that's right. So I think there is an opportunity to kind of parlay that into some new moves. But this is again going back to Kerry. I mean, I think the great line that I heard from one Israeli official when I was there was that Kerry is being sent out like Noah's dove, to see if he brings back an olive branch. Basically all that to say Obama is, he's got more than enough on his plate on foreign policy and, let alone domestic policy, certainly, and he wants a very, very strong sense that there's a very good chance, or at least a moderately good chance, that engaging in this issue would be productive and positive before he uses this new capital that he's gained from re-election.
Well, and also Kerry is just not Baker. I mean, individuals matter, right? I mean, Baker he wanted to do that. He could do that.
Right.
It's not clear that others could. But here, this is also why I think it's an opportunity, but it's a broader sort of convergence of factors that matter. I agree with you that, let's say, the occupation, the status quo, the way things are going have become fairly well entrenched, that it'll take considerable more momentum now to shift things or to move things than it would have, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. But this is where the Israeli domestic space comes in. In the case of Shamir, for example, sure, he went to Madrid and he engaged in this process, but Israelis had a choice between Shamir and Rabin. And even though the evidence indicates that they didn't vote for Rabin to go talk to the PLO or to make peace with the Palestinians, some of that was relevant. Today, there was a choice. There was Meretz, there was Labor. Some people thought Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid was a choice. But until Israelis and Bibi and the main political parties understand that there are these domestic political costs, not just from one segment of the population, i.e. the settlers or the right.
Yeah.
If Bibi knows that his back is covered domestically, then again, he won't move. Without a real sense that there's an alternative pushing for this within Israel, I think it would be harder for the United States to be able to push it. It's not, again, I think it's a convergence of factors, and the U.S. cannot do it alone.
Yeah.
But that's where, I've had a couple conversations recently with, leftist activists in Israel, and the sense is that there needs to be a better choice, a better message by the left in Israel to provide that alternative that can then work in conjunction with, let's say, other factors of the U.S.
Right, and then coming back to the issue of pressure, as someone who's genuinely, or generally, I guess, skeptical. Let's look at Iran. I mean, the idea that I disagree with is that if you pressure Iran enough, the Iranian people will get so angry about this economic pressure and this isolation that they will oppose their own government. And I just don't. That's really work. And I think we need to apply the same to Israel, right? What sort of pressure? I mean, I know we're talking about different kinds of pressure.
Sure.
I'm going to get to that point, but just as a general idea, this is the problem I have with BDS, or one of the problems I have with it. Is, this idea that through boycotts and these kinds of sanctions and isolation, that you can convince a large enough segment of Israeli society, to change their government. It just, I see. It's clearer to me that you're causing a rally around the flag effect,
right?
And I think you can see similar things in Iran, not to draw an equivalence between the two situations, but there are similarities. Sure. But again, I think this is where, I think the president's trip was so important, was to, he's there, he wasn't there to scold. He was there to say, listen, right. I understand you're in a tough situation.
Right.
And that's why I think that was really important.
I agree.
I understand, to use the language that Israelis often use, you live in a tough neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But, here are some things that he thinks need to happen. So he spoke in a positive way, in a reassuring way, but still in an encouraging, pushing way.
Right.
But so I guess the question is, I'm kind of curious about is, can the United States, can President Obama, stand there next to the Israelis and continue to support them? And he made reference to this, and he was like, I stand with you, I understand your situation, but there's this pressure coming out there.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and he spoke in a really interestingly sort of oblique way. It's like, there's this rising tide
right.
of anger at Israel for what your government is doing, and I want to help you, here's some things you could do
mm-hmm.
to deal with that. Did you get that sense too?
Yeah, I mean, are you asking, can he say, look, I'm your friend, but hey, I also need to apply this pressure to you?
Well, no, I'm saying it's more of like he's going to be the good cop.
And who will be the bad cop?
That's the question, whether it's the Europeans.
Right.
That's an open question. I don't know whether they can get it together to actually apply pressure, or whether you're totally talking about,
mm-hmm.
Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, civil society groups, or whether that is even, whether that whole scenario could even create the outcome that we're talking about.
I'm not sure in this case if you need a good and a bad cop. So you mentioned the analogy. I think back to the Law and Order days when the original series was on, before they shamelessly took it off. But there would be they would have one detective in the room, yeah. and they would alternate between yelling and saying, "Look, things are going bad, but I can help you. If you talk to me, I can help you." They didn't have to send somebody else in to be the good cop and the bad cop, although they sometimes did. But I think Obama can say that. He can, he has that ability, just rhetorically, but what he represents. Look, I believe in you guys. I believe that you're threatened. I believe that you have a right to be here. But look, the truth is that this is harmful for you, and there are some real moral, ethical questions here that you really need to struggle with. And I think that he could do that. He could say that. Yeah. That alone won't move. It won't move the Israelis, but I think it's an important part of it.
So using that to sort of open political space in Israel that hopefully gets filled by,
right.
Who, that's, I guess, the question. Who is that leader?
Right. And
or that group of leaders.
And what's unfortunate is that it looks like the left in Israel is not, there are groups and there are institutes and actors working on that, but yeah. I think at this point in time, the Labour Party represents the best institutional political vehicle for that kind of change. But the Labour Party, there's already reports that there's going to be, with the Labour Party's, by law, it has to hold primaries again within a certain amount of time after the elections. If current leader Shelley Yachimovich is deposed or changed, Labor is just collapsing in on itself, and if it hasn't learned anything from the last little while and it destroys itself, I'm not sure what will replace it. If there is no viable alternative, then Bibi has nothing to be afraid of. And contrary to what many people thought, at this point it looks like Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid are not viable alternatives, at least on, let's say, on the peace front. They've enabled Jewish Home to come in and into the government and to put its demands and its interests into government policy and into government decision making.
All right. Well, that remains, I guess, seriously remains to be seen. I think the response to that I have heard from others who have voiced similar concerns is that, well, listen, Lapid got finance. He wanted foreign ministry. He got finance. If he wants to fulfill his ambitions to succeed Bibi, he needs to do well in finance.
He does, but again, it's not clear what is he the one who would really pick up the flag of what we'll call them the peace camp, even though, again, that the peace camp is often seen as a derogatory term in Israel, or even outside of Israel. But is he the one to do that? Well, I'm not so sure. He's insisted that he won't divide Jerusalem. He hasn't talked about reducing resources and funds that go toward the settlements. He hasn't really talked about anything that might have an impact on that. And he allied himself very, very staunchly with Naftali Bennett. I'm not so sure that alliance will stand, the test of time, but for now, it clearly was an important part of his political aspirations.
Yeah, I want to get to, well, while we have time, I want to get to your recent Open Zion piece, but just on that point, I mean, this is something I'd like to write about in the future, but, looking at the situation of the left, the peace camp and the left in Israel, and, this is something I talked about with a number of friends when I was there, and have continued these discussions, but, looking at, comparing the left in Israel to the left in the U.S., and obviously there are a lot of differences, but when you look at the issues of security, the right had just that, they had it locked down. In the American, after Vietnam, American conservatives just had this national security issue under control for, about 30 years. And as try as they might, they tried various ways. The Democrats, they tried to be just as tough as, they tried to come up with all kinds of messages about national security. But at the end of the day, what it took for Democrats and liberals to really make up that ground, it was a massive screw-up by the right. It was Iraq. In the absence of the Iraq debacle, I can't imagine a scenario in which you actually see Democrats polling remotely as well compared to Republicans, and so I wonder that. I mean, you can for the left in Israel, they can come up with as many great sound bites and talking points and arguments as they want, but in the absence of a major governance failure by the right that creates a political opening, and again, I would not wish this sort of crisis on any country. Sure. You know what I'm saying? Sure. It's like I don't wish that Israel would undergo the sort of crisis that I'm talking about because, Iraq was horrible for the United States. Obviously, it was horrible for lots of other people too. But, in terms of, for the American political scene, that's what it took to move, to boost the Democrats. Right. So they were competitive on this issue. So I just wonder, in the absence of something like that, and it may not necessarily even be a national security issue. It could be economics. Sure. Go ahead.
I'm not so sure that translates as well or as easily or comfortably into the Israeli scene because for two reasons. First, I mean, don't forget that Israel was governed by the left for the first 30 years of its existence, and that left engaged in a number of, violence was part of government policy. Putting aside the question of whether it was necessary or right, but it wasn't afraid to use violence or to go to war. But it also wasn't afraid to engage with many different actors when it was perceived necessary. The left in Israel, it's a different conceptualization. But the other thing is that I think Israel has essentially
Just to jump in, I think that's also true of the Democrats. And when you had the Cold War,
sure.
I think, but it was just Vietnam that created this sense of the Democrats as weak on defense in a similar way to the Second Intifada discredited in the eyes of so many Israelis Oslo.
Sure.
And, created, so that's the similarity that I see.
But, that leads to my second point, which by the time of the Second Intifada, if you look who was leading the left camp, Rabin was sort of the last, and I'll use the word great, but the last sort of larger-than-life leader who could really capture Israelis' attention. Israelis like security people at the top. They like people who are tough, who know what they're talking about, who have those qualifications. And really, after Rabin's assassination, this is one of the reasons why it was so traumatic for the peace process itself, was that there was nobody to really take up the same mantle as him and to occupy the same position. And so the left became associated with all these Shimon Peres-like characters and dreamers and people who talk in these grand slogans and writers like David Grossman and Amos Oz, people who could not just say, look, I'm going to be tough when I need to be. I understand that these guys we're making peace with are not very nice, but we have to do it. That's what Rabin did. There's nobody really capable of doing that right now. But, the Israelis are used to lurching from crisis to crisis or war to war or, violent episode to violent episode. A violent episode by itself, a major war, major crisis would not change the trajectory as much as it might in the United States, because we've already seen that happening, right? We had Lebanon 2006.
Right.
We
that's
had
a good point.
Cast Lead. The context is different.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So let's move on in the time we have left to the recent piece you wrote in Open Zion,
Okay.
Looking at the Emergency Committee for Israel, what their goals were and what the impact is. Why don't you just kind of set this up for us on what you said in the piece?
Sure. So, I mean, the Emergency Committee for Israel was recently formed in the last few years to respond as Zionist groups in the United States and elsewhere, historically speaking, in the 20th century and so on. There were a number of emergency committees that were formed because it was the sense that Zionism or the Jews or Jews in Palestine or Israel was in an emergency. So it sort of harkens back to this notion that right now there's a real emergency and crisis for Israel, and we need to rally around Israel. Mm-hmm. And it was formed as a response to, let's say, J Street or even AIPAC or in response to AIPAC. But it's associated with the Republican Party. It's pretty much it's very small, but it's run by people, mostly, all of them are hawkish, many of them are Jews, but closely associated with Republican rhetoric and policies. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was the Israel Policy Forum sent a letter signed by 100 prominent American Jews. Right. Many of them were not political activists, but prominent Jews in arts, business, and so on, community leadership, in which they called for Israel to, while keeping in mind its security, make quote-unquote painful territorial sacrifices. Mm-hmm. So ECI was not happy about that, and they sent a letter signed by 5 members of ECI, the 5 main leaders of it, or the main backers, and sent it to Netanyahu and said, look, these people don't know what they're talking about. They're delusional. They always give bad advice. We know you don't need to hear from us, but you just go ahead and sort of do your own thing. Mm-hmm. And the whole letter read like its purpose was not to tell Netanyahu or Israelis something, but to delegitimize those in the United States with whom they disagreed with, which is essentially people in the center left, and on the left. And so in the piece,
in other words, the overwhelming majority of American Jews.
Yes. Yes. And so that's why, I mean, it's not the number 100 of the signatories to the first letter and then 5. I mean, that's telling, right? That's representative. It's actually a good sort of physical representation you can point to and point to where each side stands on this broad spectrum. But, so in the piece, I just deconstructed the letter and showed, I mean, ECI's goal they don't have, their power and their position is limited. And so what they've been doing, and they really did this with Chuck Hagel nomination, whole process, was control the language and try to delegitimize those who either supported Chuck Hagel or didn't think he was anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, and then people who might write letters like this. They're trying to shift the discourse, and this is why I mentioned AIPAC previously, because AIPAC, in many ways, has to respond to that. Mm-hmm. And so it has to accept ECI's language, or it has to say, you know what, no, we're not going that way, and then sort of has to pull back away. And so if ECI, by controlling the discourse and the language, can get people or actors or other institutions on board with it, then it quote-unquote wins.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think the impact of ECI has been overall? I mean, do you think they've succeeded to some extent?
I guess I would say in which arena?
Well, in that goal that you're talking about, in policing the language, have they raised the cost for certain types of language, do you think?
I think that they have. I think in the case of Chuck Hagel, I think that they really were, let's say, I think they were successful in getting other groups to adopt similar language. So there were other Jewish institutions. AIPAC tried to stay out of it, but there were other Jewish institutions that adopted some of the same language. Where they've really been successful also is in the Republican Party itself, because you saw, so the Washington Free Beacon, which is, let's say it's a right-wing Republican-affiliated magazine or media source, there are a lot of people associated with that also connected to ECI. Right. When the Free Beacon would publish things that ECI was concerned about or talked about, you would then see these Republican leaders like Lindsey Graham pick up on these kinds of things. So I think they've been successful in providing Republicans, let's say on the far right end of the spectrum, with ammunition or information. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they've been successful in the broader Jewish community. Mm-hmm. To the extent
getting talking points into the hands of politicians is fine and not that hard. I mean, getting all these politicians to repeat the same talking points, okay, I mean, that's
sure.
Recognize that. But in terms of what they actually achieved, well, Obama won.
He won.
Hagel got in. Hagel was confirmed. I mean, I guess they were succeeded in making a much bloodier fight.
That's what I would have said, yeah.
Expected it to be. And I think there is, if you want to talk about their success versus failures, I mean, did they succeed in kind of, for someone, for some up-and-coming policy person who's like, I might want to be Secretary of Defense someday, is he or she going to be much more circumspect about the way that, things that they say about Israel or about the Israeli-Palestinian issue or about the U.S.-Israel relationship? Very possibly.
Sure. Yeah, that's what I think. I think they did make the battle a lot bloodier than it might have been otherwise. But by introducing language and certain language and keywords and discourse and harping on anti-Semitism or at least more anti-Israel, they were able to make people have to respond to that or account for it at the political level. Right? We had a discussion on Twitter about the public debate on Iran. I mean, ECI doesn't. They talk about Iran a little bit, but by doing that, they are changing the public discourse in their favor, which is essentially damping down the public discourse. Or what discourse there might be is not a debate, but an adoption of their preferences.
Or a shouting match.
Or sure, even that, sure.
But at the same time, I look at that first salvo that was published with the anonymous Senate aide who seemed to show up 12 times in every story that the neo-cons wrote about Hegel. Send him up here and we'll show everyone he's an anti-Semite.
Right.
That, to my mind, was a huge bust. Because while it's true what you've just said about, raising the cost and making the fight bloody, it seems to me that you had a real, at least I sensed to some extent, there was an outpouring of support for Hegel, and a lot of articles written of saying, this is just bullshit.
Yeah.
People using this sort of language, this is a policy disagreement. If you disagree with Hegel's views on Israel, if you disagree with his policy views, if you don't think if he's qualified to be Secretary of Defense, make that argument. But to go from, step one, from zero to anti-Semite in 6 seconds like this is just absurd.
Well, I mean, you could say that it got the issue out there even more because, the famous Elliot Abrams interview on NPR. I mean, people could start saying, look, there is this kind of evidence. But where I think the danger, I agree that it was a bust in the sense that, no, they didn't stop the process. But I'm not sure that they knew that they could or that they were expecting to.
Well, no, but you had Elliot Abrams and you had Richard Haas, cuffing Elliot Abrams publicly, saying, that sort of language is not okay.
But if they don't stop using that language, then it doesn't matter what others say.
Right. I think that is the key point. Is like, what costs are there for just recklessly and dishonestly throwing these kinds of accusations out there?
And it doesn't look like there are costs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the real problem, is that people can just kind of come out of the woodwork, make these claims with no evidence, and then sort of slink back into the grass for the next opportunity, and there's really no cost for it.
Right, and the other thing I would add is that I think that there have been some moderate successes, not at that broader American political level, but let's say at the Jewish political level, where you did have Jewish institutions coming out and using similar language and expressing concerns. Now, it was qualified. So Abe Foxman of the ADL, he repeated some of the accusations, or at least in a broader way. He also qualified it by saying, well, I'm not going to necessarily oppose it. But he still did it. I mean, he still said something about it, and he still used the language. I think that is, bringing ECI trying to bring ECI into the mainstream, make it more legitimate, more representative, and more credible. I think there's been some movement on that. Very, very small. But that's at the Jewish institutional level, not at the broader level. And as you said, if there are no costs to Elliot Abrams saying this, or to Lindsey Graham picking up a story from the Free Beacon and running with it, then they are going to keep working on these tactics.
All right. Well, go ahead.
Do you think that they've constrained the debate on Iran?
I think they have made it much uglier. I don't know if constrain is the word that I'd use. But I think the problem that I have is, ECI is an organization that, has been shown to be dishonest repeatedly, having its claims debunked and rated false by all the various, PolitiFact, et cetera, et cetera. But, again, this is the Bill Kristol issue. I mean, the guy is just a straight bullshitter. He's very smart. He's very good at finding issues that he can exploit effectively to kind of increase his influence. But he and the various organizations that he kind of creates every week, it seems. There's really no cost to them that I can discern for acting this dishonestly, and I think that's a real problem for American politics.
I think one could also add that when they Project for a New American Century, and when there were some more serious ideas and debates, let's say that when the neocons first sort of were forming or came to power, it was a little bit more. It was more serious then. But that since they let's say they won Iraq, they won the Iraq debate because there was an invasion, but they've been losing it ever since because of the backlash, that perhaps they're feeling this sense that they need to be a little bit more over the top or a little bit more emotional and evocative and sort of this loud, boisterous coming out into the public sphere. Perhaps that's a reaction also.
Well, no, I think the very fact that they had to sort of end Project for New American Century and reboot it as the foreign policy initiative, showed some recognition that it had been seriously tarred. But as far as like the intellectual seriousness, I think we can just I'll just finish by saying, listen, the descent from Irving Kristol to Michael Goldfarb is steep from an intellectual point of view. So
fair enough.
All right. So thanks so much, Brent.
Thanks for having me.
I look forward to doing this again, and thanks to all the viewers, and look forward to reading your comments on the website. So I'll talk to you later, Brent.
Okay, thanks.